Hello, and welcome to the Healthy Minds Summer Series. I'm Peter Neufeld and part of the HR team here at Maple Leaf, and it's great that you can join us today. I know as we look at this series, a lot of people that I'm talking with are saying, oh no, it's the end of the summer. So I was just doing a quick check, and if we go by the change of seasons with calendars, we still have 6 weeks left. So hopefully that puts a smile on your face to know that we're not at the end of it yet, and there's still a lot to enjoy. Just a reminder in terms of how our setup is for our time together today. We're going to be hearing from our guest speaker in a moment, who I'll introduce, and then we're going to be spending the last 15 minutes of our time together doing Q&A. So if you have any questions, just click on the question mark in the top right corner of your screen. Documented at any time. I'll be monitoring those, and we'll get to as many as we can. So without further instructions, I'd like to jump into introducing you to Dr. Timothy Caulfield. Dr. Caulfield, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I know your area is in terms of looking at debunking health myths, and I can only imagine how busy it is for you these days if it looks anything like my own social feeds, where I found out that I have a much more eclectic friend group than I knew in terms of when I look at what they're posting and saying on the subject of COVID and many of the things we're seeing.
Yeah, it really is a remarkable time, as I'll say in my presentation. It's become really an infodemic, as my title highlights, and it's having a real impact, not just in the context of how we're responding to the pandemic, but also for people's health and for people's stress levels.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So thank you for joining, and I'm going to pass it over to you, and then we'll continue with some questions later.
Excellent. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Maple Leaf for this opportunity. I think it is a wonderful time to reflect, to really reflect on wellness, to reflect on what makes us healthy. But as you said in the intro, to really think about all this misinformation that is surrounding us right now. I've been studying misinformation for over 2 decades. And I've never seen anything like this. I've never seen anything like this in the context of just the amount of it, but also the measurable impact that it's having. So here, I'm really this is a call to arms that all of us need to battle the infodemic. So buckle up and let's get started. Next slide.
Excellent.
So there really is misinformation absolutely everywhere. And this health misinformation has been around for a really long time. It was around obviously before the pandemic, having an adverse impact, but we're seeing all these crazy things now with the pandemic, and it's a really good opportunity to reflect on the impact that's having. So you guys know this, you guys have seen this. In the context of the pandemic, you're seeing misinformation about 5G, this idea that 5G technology is the cause. You're seeing misinformation around the idea that it's a bioweapon from China. You're seeing misinformation around the role of big pharma. You're seeing misinformation around cures like hydroxychloroquine and really crazy stuff like you're supposed to drink bleach and even cow urine. I don't know if you guys have heard this one, the idea that cow urine can cure the coronavirus. Of course, all of it is nonsense, but it's out there. It's out there, it's stressing us out, and it's having an impact on the decisions that we're making. Next slide. The other thing it's important to recognize is that people believe this stuff. It may sound like it is extreme, but there was a really interesting study from Carleton, some colleagues of mine did this work, where they found that about half of Canadians, think about that, about half of Canadians believes one of the extreme conspiracy theories. So the thing around 5G, or the idea about it being a bioweapon, or the idea that hydroxychloroquine actually works, or that there's some kind of secret nefarious agenda at play. About half of Canadians believe that. And look at that next stat. 28% of Americans believe that Bill Gates started the pandemic so he could put a microchip in a vaccine and sort of monitor all of us. I mean, that is a hardcore conspiracy theory. I mean, think what has to happen to have that play out. And 28% of Americans believe it. What's really interesting also is research has found that more people in the younger demographic, so I'm not talking really young, but 30 and below, tend to believe these kinds of conspiracies and misinformations more. Why is that the case? They're not dumber. They don't have less critical thinking skills. Next slide. It's probably because they just have more exposure to social media. So this is a really interesting study that came out of McGill, I believe just a couple of weeks ago, where they found, and this backs up other work that's been done in the United States and the UK, where they found that just exposure to social media means you're more likely to be misinformed, more likely to believe this misinformation. There was another study that found that a lot of it comes from Facebook, and that what happens is people are they're just sharing this stuff, right? So this is where it comes from. But first of all, we have to remember that social media is spreading it, but it's also stressing all of us out. Next slide, please. This is another important source to think about. I'm sure many people online heard about the documentary Plandemic. Did you guys hear about this one? This is just one example of the power of a slick presentation, the power of a narrative, the power of a testimonial. So Plandemic is a documentary, I'm putting that in quotes, where they basically provide evidence to back up all of these crazy conspiracy theories. But look at this reporting from the New York Times. Look how popular the Plandemic was. It was more popular than the reunion of The Office. It beat Taylor Swift, for goodness sake. I mean, the Plandemic had an incredible impact, incredible uptake, because it was a compelling story. It was presented in a very slick fashion, and research tells us if you can present your facts, in a highly produced manner, they seem more credible, they're more persuasive, and it played to our fears, right? It provided this narrative that filled in the uncertainty that's out there, and all of those things are sort of the foundation for the belief in conspiracy theories. So be on the watch for those things. Don't get pulled into this. Don't get pulled into misinformation like the Plandemic. Next slide, please. Of course, the other thing that we're seeing is people are exploiting. They're exploiting this situation to sell nonsense, to sell misinformation. And one of the things that we're actually studying is this idea of immune boosting. It's everywhere right now. This idea that you're supposed to be able to boost your immune system. I'm sure you guys have seen this. And in fact, the idea of immune boosting is a very questionable, very iffy scientific concept. You really can't boost your immune system. You don't want to boost your immune system, right? That's anaphylaxis. That's autoimmune diseases. What you want is a balanced immune system, a healthy immune system, right? And I'll come at the end. I'll come to what we can do to get to that. But people are selling a whole bunch of products and ideas. The bottom line is you can't boost your immune system with yoga, with chiropractors, with homeopaths, with naturopaths, with herbalists, or with Tom Brady. Now look, I'm a huge Patriots fan. I'm a huge Tom Brady. Actually, there's a Tom Brady stuffy right there. Hey, Tom. So it breaks my heart that Tom is trying to exploit this situation to sell product that doesn't have any evidence behind it, but it matters. Next slide, please. We did a study, and this is actually out for peer review right now, where we looked at hundreds. We kind of pretended we were a consumer, getting on Google, trying to find something to boost our immune system. And we looked at hundreds of websites, hundreds of them. And what we found was, we were surprised by the result. Over 85% of those websites presents immune boosting as a real thing. And remember, it's not really a real thing. And it's beneficial for fighting COVID-19. That's incredible, right? So that's the kind of exposure to misinformation people are getting. And this next number was really shocking to us. Only 10% of the websites, so the stuff that you would find searching immune boosting on the internet, only 10% of them have any kind of critical appraisal of the concept. So, that's the world that we're living in. There's a lot of misinformation out there, a lot of confusing messaging, and it's having an impact. Next slide, please. So this does do real harm, and we shouldn't forget that. Misinformation just isn't an annoyance. It creates real harm. It causes physical harm. It causes death. In fact, there was a study that came out just today from the UK that talked about thousands of hospitalizations in the UK as a result of misinformation, and hundreds of deaths, you guys. So this really does matter. There's interesting research that has shown that it's increased stigma and discrimination against particular groups. There's been property damage. People have been pulling down 5G towers because of misinformation. It's had an adverse impact on science and health policy. And I think the hydroxychloroquine debacle is a really good example of that. And it's also just added to the chaotic information environment that stresses us all out. Next slide, please. And there's really interesting research to show that this chaotic information environment, all this misinformation sort of overloads our ability to differentiate what's real and what's not real. So not only are we more likely to believe misinformation because of all this noise, it is also much more difficult for us to tease out what's real and what's not real. Next slide. So what can we do, right? What can we do? Well, first of all, we shouldn't let this stress us out, because research tells us that this noise, this misinformation stresses us out also, and that has a real impact. Next slide, please. There's interesting research to show that this environment not only causes that we to believe misinformation, that misinformation stresses us out, and that stress causes us to be less healthy and to be less well. And that's really important to matter. So not only is misinformation bad for fighting the pandemic, not only is it bad for our critical thinking, it's bad for our health too. Next slide. So first thing we got to do as a team, you guys, we all have to fight the misinformation. We've got to all become part of the debunking team. I really believe all of us can be part of this, the Go Science team, as I like to say. And this is some work that we're doing right now. What we came up with is a list of evidence-based ways that you can counter misinformation. So I'll do this real quickly, but I think it's important to note that we can all do this. We can all get on social media. We can all be part of the conversation. So number one, provide good science. Yes, this works. There's interesting research that shows it works. Provide it in a clear and shareable content. I always think, what's this going to look like on Facebook? What's this going to look like on Instagram? Use trustworthy and independent sources. So go to those entities, the World Health Organization, Public Health Agency of Canada, that aggregate the science in a responsible manner. If possible, talk about consensus, the scientific consensus, the body of evidence. There's interesting research that shows that really matters. We've done that work in the context of vaccines. Be nice. This is hard, actually. Look, I just made fun of Tom Brady. It's hard. It's hard to be nice when you're frustrated. But science also tells us if you're nice and if you're authentic and you're humble and you really listen, people will view you as more credible and you'd be more persuasive. And it can be hard. I screw up on this all the time when I get angry, but really try. The other important thing is let's use creative communication strategies. Let's use humor, let's use videos, and let's use narratives, just like the people who are trying to push the misinformation, just like the people who pushed the pandemic. Let's use those stories, let's use those narratives to get across the real stuff. Highlight the logic gaps and the rhetorical devices that are used to push misinformation. Note that this is a conspiracy theory. Note that they're just relying on anecdotes. Highlight that they're not representing risk in a real way. If you do that, you can have an impact. And I think number 9 is perhaps the most important. And I also screw up on this one sometimes. I got to remind myself of it. Don't get pulled into a debate with a denier. You're never going to change their minds. Always think about the general public. Think about the people that are just trying to figure this stuff out. The general public is the audience. Not those hardcore deniers. Next slide, please. So the other really important thing to remember is, look, all of us want to be accurate. One of my colleagues, Gordon Pennycook, he's at the University of Regina, has done really cool empirical research to show that, look, most Canadians, they want to be accurate. They don't have some kind of nefarious agenda to push misinformation. They want to be accurate. And if you can just nudge people to think about accuracy before you share, you're more likely not to share misinformation. And to think about accuracy before you read something, you're less likely to believe misinformation. I know that sounds ridiculously simple, like a ridiculously simple strategy, but it really works. And one of the problems is entities like social media, these social media platforms, they don't really invite reflection, do they? They don't really invite us to think about accuracy. They're frenetic places, right? They want us to be stressed. They want us to act quickly. That's the way those platforms are designed. So if you can just remind yourself to pause before you eat, consume social media, and especially before you share it, we can have an impact. So this is a campaign that we're doing with Media Smarts in order to try to convince and encourage Canadians to do that, to become part of the solution, to part of the help. Next slide, please. And really, it's this simple thing. We just want people to check first and share after. Check first, share after. If we can just encourage ourselves and our friends to do that, we can have a real impact. Next slide, please. But more than anything, I think all this misinformation around the pandemic, around the pandemic, is a good opportunity to think about what we all really need to do to live a healthy lifestyle. Whether you're talking about sort of preparing for COVID-19, protecting yourself and your family against COVID-19, or whether you're just talking about living a healthy lifestyle. I know you guys have probably heard this all before, but it's good to reflect on this, because so much of what's out there is noise. The wellness industry is a multi-trillion dollar industry, and most of that is based on misinformation. Most of it does not have a scientific background. Most of it is just trying to add to this chaotic information environment to sell product in order to get you to believe some kind of ideology, in order to push forward some agenda. You can ignore most of that noise and focus on those simple things that are really needed, that will get us most of the way to a healthy lifestyle. Of course, socioeconomics, one of the biggest things, right? But beyond that, what we're talking about is, number one, you don't smoke. If you smoke, almost nothing else matters, right? You don't smoke. You get exercise. And by that, I mean, just get out there and move. Yes, there's certain exercises that are probably more efficient to create physiological change, intervals and lifting. But the important thing is just to move. And I know you've heard that before, but it's so important to remember that. Exercise. Number three, really important for this group, right? Real food. There is no magic diet. I know everyone hears this all the time, but if you look at the long-term studies that go 2-3 years, there really is no magic diet. It's like lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, real protein. There is no magic, but eat the real food. And number four, I've often thought about taking this one off because maintaining a healthy weight is really tough. And we all come in different shapes and sizes, and we can all be healthy in different shapes and sizes. It's really about a healthy lifestyle. But I leave it on because I think it is important to think about trying to maintain a healthy weight. I think that's part of a global strategy. Number five, prevention. Vaccines. Obviously, the greatest single achievement of biomedicine is getting a vaccine. Saves millions of lives every year, and I hope soon we're going to have a COVID-19 vaccine. So vaccines, seatbelts, and washing your hands. Another one that is so important. Number six, having good relationships, having good connections, being part of a community. Increasing body of evidence to show how important that is. In fact, years ago, I did not have this on my list, but the body of evidence is emerging about how important community relationships, being in touch, it really matters. Number seven, I'm not very good at it. Sleep, get a good night's sleep. And I've just added number 8 for this pandemic time, right? Physical distancing, masks. Yes, I know the evidence is shifting on masks, but the body of evidence now says they're important. Scientific plausibility says they're important. Also a symbol of solidarity. So physical distancing, masks, washing your hands, doing sensible things when you do have the symptoms. These are the things that we need to do. These are the needed things, you guys, and you can ignore almost all the other noise, including the noise around immune boosting. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much again for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, Maple Leaf. And I'm really looking forward to your questions, your comments. There's so much misinformation out there. Really curious what you guys are thinking about, what you're hearing, and what your questions might be. So thanks again very much.
So thank you again, Dr. Caulfield. Again, folks, if you have questions, I remind you, just click on the icon. We have a number of them here already. A couple of questions here are around mistrust of government. And I know sometimes we think about in terms of mistrust of foreign governments, but people here are saying too, okay, what about mistrust of our own government? And, and so do you have any advice or comments for people who wonder even if they can fully trust the stats that we're getting and the information from our own Canadian government?
This is an excellent question and a great question to start with. And I actually thought about it as I was saying, you've got to use reliable and trustworthy sources of information. And the problem is that there has been an erosion of trust. Now, in Canada, research tells us that levels of trust are still pretty darn high, compared to the United States, for example. Still really high in entities like the Public Health Agency of Canada, in the medical community, in the public health community more broadly. So that's the good news. But the bad news is there has been an erosion of trust. Even before the pandemic, research tells us that we're on almost an all-time low for trust in broader, in our institutions. And then you look at the United States, where it has become incredibly polarized. And there's really interesting research to show, and it's correlational in nature, it's hard to study this well, that low levels of trust are associated with, probably no surprise, but it's important to recognize this, with not taking preventative health strategies, with believing the misinformation. So I think that it's important to recognize that places like the World Health Organization, the Public Health Agency of Canada, the provincial health authorities, they've done a pretty good job. Yes, there have been screw ups, and I hope we learn from them, and science communication strategies in the future are better. But we have to remember that these are moving targets, and they're doing their best to aggregate this science in a responsible manner, but also trying to make it relevant to the local situation. And that's why you'll often get, different recommendations, and the recommendations will be shifting, and masks is a really good example of that. So yes, I think that we can, in general, turn to these entities like the Public Health Agency of Canada to get general advice. Always go to something that has a body of evidence behind it. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't hold them to the fire, right? We should make sure that they continue to be trustworthy. But we can, I think, turn to the science that is emerging here. But I do think that one of the things that we learned from this the pandemic is just how important trust is in this context. And we've got to do everything we can to earn it and keep it.
Yeah. There's a question here in terms of looking at media sources. So people often have their favorite source and go-to sources, be them online or through networks in terms of consuming information. Any advice in terms of how to filter through even media sources when some seem to be more left, some seem to be more right? Do you balance between the two, or do you try and find one in the middle?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think people do have very powerful confirmation biases, right? And research backs this up again and again. In the context of the COVID-19 crisis, there's been really interesting research that has shown that the news sources, and we even found this ourselves, like, yes, they haven't been ideal, right? The major news entities, traditional news sources, they haven't been ideal, but they've done a pretty good job. And we even found that in our own preliminary research as compared to social media. And so these traditional sources of news have been found to be correlated with, and people follow traditional sources of news, whether they lean left or right, are more likely to take preventative strategies. But we do, I think, need to recognize that we have to fight our own confirmation biases. So one of the things that I do, it can be painful, you guys, is I find a couple of sources that are still credible. I'm not talking about wingnut sources, that are still credible, that lean a different direction than my perspective. And I look at them every day to see how they're representing the story. Now, I'm not going to name names here because I don't want to paint myself into a corner here, but I try to go to news sources that are counter. And the other thing that I do is I try to look at academic papers that run counter to my preconceived notion and idea. And I'm doing that more and more. I always do. That's the strategy I've always used, but in the context of the pandemic, I've been doing that even more. And so I think it's really important. So it's a great question. It's really important to check our own biases our own tendencies and to try to find credible sources that may give us a different perspective. So I think that's a great suggestion from that flows from this question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it fits very much with our Maple Leaf values and culture is very data driven. But we also believe in curiosity and asking questions and understanding. And I really like what you're highlighting there, that we can't just assume that our interpretation of something is correct. We need to speak to other people to kind of broaden our view. There's questions here around, I think it builds off of what you just said, but I like this terminology. It says people can seem to be in their own belief bunker, saying that no matter what you say, they're dismissive of the facts and they're dismissive of other information. One of your tips was around being kind and humble in talking to others, but do you have any other advice for people who would be quite dogmatic in their views?
Yeah. These filter bubbles, right? I love the belief bunkers. I'm going to steal that from your. So I love that phrase because it is a great. It really illustrates what's going on, and again, it goes to this confirmation bias, and it also goes to this idea that one of the things social media has done. Not only does it spread misinformation, it allows the creation of these communities, right? These communities of like-minded individuals that sort of reinforce our preconceived notions. And there's been a lot of really interesting research around anti-vaxxers that have demonstrated how powerful this can be. So the good news is there aren't that many hardcore deniers, we'll call it that way. I put those stats up that are really shocking that say 50% of Canadians, believe a conspiracy theory. But if you really dig down, if you do more qualitative work, you find that it's a pretty small percentage that are the hardcore people that you're never going to change their mind. See, once an individual becomes a hardcore denier, it becomes part of their personal brand, their personal identity, it becomes, and I'm sure people know people like this, it becomes very difficult to change their minds, right? Because it's who they are now. But if you look at the data from anti-vaxxers, and GMOs is another good example, those individuals are a relatively small percentage, definitely single digit. The good news is we can change the minds of the individual who are hesitant about, I'm using hesitant language coming from the vaccine research, but I think we can apply it more broadly. Those who are just, open to the idea that the conspiracy theory might be true are sort of leaning that way. And research tells us if we use those strategies I just talked about, you can change their minds. You can influence. Now, we're talking about moving the needle here. We're not going to change everyone's mind, but moving the needle is important when you're talking about a phenomenon as problematic as the spread of misinformation. So yes, being kind and listening. What is their exact concern? Why do they believe this? What are they trying to answer with this belief system that they've adopted? And providing them with information that counters that. And often, using a narrative yourself, using your own examples, being authentic, really can have an impact. And by the way, you're not necessarily going to change their mind right in real time. I mean, how many times people go, you know what, you're right, I'm going to change my mind. I think that never happens, but they might reflect on it. And more importantly, you might influence how they see the world down the road.
So we have a question here, and I think this is a bigger one. Hopefully we can cover it at least quickly in the time left. And it's about bubbles. On the subject of trust, how can we trust the government when their advice to bubble with 10 people, and now in a few weeks school will be starting and our kids will be with 30?
Yeah. This is one I hear a lot. It's a great question. We are trying to make decisions with imperfect information. We're trying to make decisions when information is evolving, the evidence is evolving. And you could say the same thing with masks, right? In February, the public health authorities were actually recommending against using masks. But that's the evidence that we had. That was the research that we had. As evidence evolves, hopefully the public health recommendations will also evolve. But it's not just the evidence that evolves, it's the social needs, the social circumstances that evolve. So what I think is important is to recognize that aspect of it, and you want public health recommendations to shift. I mean, that should be a badge of honor. That means they are shifting with the science. That shouldn't be a reason not to trust. It should be a reason to trust, because these are individuals or these are entities that are trying to be nimble and trying to adjust according to both the science and the circumstances. Having said that, I think it's really important for public health policymakers to be completely transparent and completely honest about both the audience, the science they're using, the state of the evidence, what the unknowns are, and why they're coming to this conclusion. And there's really interesting research that shows that if you do that, people are more likely to view you as credible and more likely to trust you. And I think too often we're not seeing that. You know, we're seeing almost a little bit of dogma coming from public health authorities. Maybe that's the wrong word, but perhaps a little too much of this definitive language instead of, look, we're doing the best we can with the evidence we have, given the goals that we're trying to achieve. So I think it's a great question, and hopefully we're going to learn from this for the future, and we can have better science communication. The next pandemic, hopefully it won't be one, but the next health crisis.
No, that's excellent. And I love what you said, though, and the reminder in terms of looking at as a positive thing when public health actually changes, because they're learning from the evidence and they're adapting rather than being dogmatic to what was said earlier. So I think that's a tremendous framing that we can probably apply in many areas of our life. As we learn and grow. Unfortunately, there's a lot of questions. Folks, thank you so much for your questions. Thank you for your engagement. And Dr. Caulfield, thank you. It's fantastic to have you with us today. And folks, I wish you a great day and a great rest of the summer and look forward to connecting again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye.